safe to say we've got a world-class group of experts who spend their waking hours thinking about issues that boards face, I'll say, in the lanes of these three critical standing committees. We've got Dave Pruner from Heidrick Struggles. He'll talk about how committees are thinking through nominating issues. We've got Travis Wofford, who's with Baker Botts, and he'll bring that legal lens and the governance perspective. So in essence, Dave and Travis are kind of tag teaming on the non-governance committee. And then we've got my good friend Jan Koors from Pearl Meyer, and she'll explore with us what's going on in the compensation space. And then wrapping up the band, Dabney, who's KPMG's leader of the Audit Committee Institute. So with that, let's get started. And Dave, we're going to tee you up first. Why don't you share some perspective about what's going on in the nominating landscape with the audience?
Gotcha. Thank you, Dennis, and NACD, thanks for having me. On the nominating committee side, it's self-explanatory, as you can imagine. I mean, the nominating committee's main role is to build and make sure the board that they've built is effective in what they do. The biggest thing we find or feel is most important is the culture of that board, and also more importantly, the culture of any new individual that's nominated. So the first thing that nominating committee does is basically set new directors and selects them to the board for a nomination and entrance to the board. So they will skinny the list down and then present it to the board for full approval. They also will look at who the committee chairs will be of the various committees and so forth, and who the members of those committees might be. The issue of culture has become incredibly important, even more so with the stress that the pandemic put on. And we now have found in the last few years that boards will go ahead and let us do culture surveys of them. And we actually, it's kind of fun, put them on a 4x4 plot of what the culture is like of each individual. It's all anonymous, and they always love to guess who's who where, which we will not tell them. But so when they see a new board member, where will that fit in? And that's become more common, as we've seen, because the pandemic got a lot of boards very introspective. The next one is on the succession side. The board's main role is also to look at the succession of other board members over various time horizons. There's always the immediate need of who's going to time out next year or who needs to retire. More and more boards have mandatory retirement age, although those are moving up. But the idea being is getting board members that have the skill sets and align with the corporate strategy over various timeframes. What do we need the next year? What do we need in the next 5 years? So a lot of the discussion we've had has been around individuals, not what are you looking to replace and what skill are you missing? What new skill do you need? Because a board member leaving is also a new opportunity to do that. And it's hard because boards will often knee-jerk back to the issue of let's replace just what we need and what we're losing. And we always are trying to push to say, no, let's look a few years out. What might you be needing? Because board terms easily can last 7-10 years plus, depending and so forth. The whole issue of board succession has gotten to be such a big deal. There's now matrices that are built of skills and needs that are basically interfaced with the strategy of the board to look at those skills to be much more scientific. And this area grew dramatically during the pandemic as boards got more introspective and were dealing with difficult issues on looking and taking longer time horizons on succession. Last of all is on the induction side, and that is when a new board member comes in, they will go ahead and look to train that member. And the corporate world is very much up their game. The public side very much, private side is catching up on the training and induction to make that board member as effective as they can. And especially when you consider you may have at minimum only 4 meetings a year to get that person inculcated into the board, the strategy, and the company. The quicker you can make them effective, the better that happens. On the NOM side, what you'll generally find is the chair of that committee generally is someone fairly important, and because of the board culture and the composition of the board being so important, you tend to get the more experienced board members that know what good looks like and have seen other board members, because there are plenty of CEOs who are great CEOs, but board membership's a little bit of a different deal when you're not chairing it. and you have to kind of take a step back. So what's happened is it tends to be the more experienced, and the chair of the nom committee tends to go ahead and be either the chairman, exec, or non-exec of the board, tends to be chair of the nom gov committee. And obviously they have a very keen interest in making sure that works well. But to give you a sense, the average chair of a nominating committee is generally just about 4 years, and that's up from 3 years a few years ago. So it's a little bit longer, but it still is just a few years. And to give you a sense of the boards out there, the S&P 500 right now, about 32% of nominating chairs are diverse. And scratch that. That's actually another board statistic we'll talk about later. 32% of them are women currently, and that has grown. That is up almost 20% over the last few years. One of the things boards have had to deal with extensively is related to activists. And that is because the nominating committee is the one creating the composition, skill sets, and quality of the board, that they are the ones that are under the greatest scrutiny when an activist goes ahead and comes in and looks at the composition of the board and starts to talk about what they like and don't like to do that. Now, different activists have different goals, be it financial goals, be it strategic goals, be it environmental issues, or a variety of things, a strategic wanting to divest of a certain subsidiary to get maximum value and so forth. The thing I would like to let you know is, well, one, as a brief aside, at Heidrick, we will not work with activists. We deal with them a lot because they're on a lot of our boards, so it's not like we're devoid of it. And one of the interesting things is they come in all shapes and sizes. And some of the bigger known that you'll see in the press regularly tend to go ahead and be a little bit more aggressive, antagonistic. But we also have worked with boards where the activists basically are able to integrate into the board well, be very reasonable, very practical, not so mono agenda focused on their one thing. So they do come in different flavors. Our favorite question to ask, which we ask in all our board interviews when putting a new board member on, is the other board members, how long do they plan on staying and being on the board? And for the activists, those questions come in all different shapes and sizes. And often we get none of your expletive business, but others will go ahead and talk about it. Here's our goals, here's where we're looking to go ahead and leave and so forth. But the thing I want to point out is NOM ends up being front and center on the activist side, but all activists are not created equal. So understanding the activist goals, intentions, and timeframes are kind of key in how that impacts the nominating committee. And that kind of concludes my comments for now.
Great, thanks, Dave, for kicking us off. I guess a question for you before we move on to Travis would be, you talked about diversity, and 35% of board leadership are gender today, which is up significantly. And it's clear, based upon all the research and the movements afoot for the last 5, maybe even 10 years, that diverse perspectives and experiences have demonstrated value time and time again. So we're no longer debating whether it's a good idea or not. But I guess my question is, if we're really honest with ourselves about the progress we've been making on the diversity front, and it gets defined in a lot of different ways. But how would we say we are doing would be the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, if we're not quite there yet, what are a couple of things that you're seeing and recommending to companies to accelerate that pace of change?
So we've actually made good progress, and it is a huge theme in the boardroom and on the board searches that we do. To put in perspective kind of where we are today, as you know, women make up more than half of the citizens in North America. When you look at the S&P, it's currently at about 32% of the board members are gender diverse, and there's various types of diversity, so we'll talk about one or two of them. At the same time, with the George Floyd period and incident that happened, the rise of racial and ethnic diversity became big. And to put in perspective, we're probably about in the 5th inning on the gender diversity issue. We're probably in about the 2nd or 3rd inning of a 9-inning baseball game, to pick an analogy here, of the diversity as it relates to race and ethnicity. So we're only at about 22% there. But to give you a sense, last year in the S&P 500, 46%, almost half of all new board members were women, and 46% were also ethnically, racially diverse. So that number goes up and up every year. And a lot of them are also, for that reason, first-time board members. It's created a little bit of a rebound because so many new board members are now being brought on. We're continuing to see expansion of companies wanting to go ahead and have board members that actually have experience, and CEOs as current board members is a very high demand category. We've seen that grow to kind of counterbalance the new board members that are coming on. Another new area we see now, it's still nascent, it's only been going on for about 2 years, is age diversity. And then there is more and more, especially companies where technology and dealing with retail and individual customers is a big deal, and the growth of millennials and Gen Z. And generally, age diversity, you qualify for that. For those on the line that want to know, if your number starts with a 4, roughly, to do that. But what happens is how it's changed the world, and what we have had to do more with our boards is make them more open, more tolerant. Because at the end of the day, we tell them you can't have it all. You can't have board experience. You can't have previous CEO experience, and you can't have age. The average age of a Russell 1000 board member, I think, is like 62 or 61 and a half. So you can't have all of those. You're going to have to look to get that diversity at other C-suite positions, which is working. CHROs, chief marketing officers, chief administrative officers, general counsel, many of those are more female dominated. As gender, for example, and some ethnically too, they become much more open to that idea, and that's opened up the door for many of those.
Hey, Dave, I know we talked about just the one question, but as you talk, a second one comes to mind. When you think about moving away from public company experience and CEO, which was those were the first 2 things people were looking for not too long ago, and you open those criteria, or you say those criteria aren't the absolute critical ones, you get younger folks, you get folks who maybe aren't in the boardroom as much as a sitting CEO or CFO. How is board orientation changing to bring those people up to speed quicker?
Yeah, so Dennis, you've hit it on the head. So I literally will call people now because of the board members saying this needs to be a diverse board member. People have bought into this. They realize the companies are better for it. So it's rare we have to make the case anymore of why you need diversity. I think everybody realizes the benefits. So I now call women, ethnic minorities that are in their 40s, and like, oh yeah, board service. So when I get near retirement, I'm like, no, I'm calling you now. You're 44, you're CFO of this company. Would you be interested? And we'll have to explain to them, what does it mean? What's the time commitment? And NACD does a great job encapsulating how much time and effort it is, because you can't take it lightly. With that said, that is what's up the induction game. And so now they will regularly put these new board members on planes before even the first meeting to go to other site locations, manufacturing locations, to get them up to speed and meet with a long slate of the management team, which is new too, more exposure to management because of that reason. But not only that, heavily with the other directors, and many of them now have a mentorship program, and they'll actually have them sit next to that person during the meeting so they can get a sense of what, because it's one extreme or the other. Either they're silent for the first 2 minutes, kind of like, we hired you for your thoughts, and the mentor will help with that, or vice versa. That's a relevant comment, but you're not the CEO of this company. That detail is for him, not for you or her. And so the mentors do a great job of kind of guiding them on trying to be as effective as possible.
Great, thanks, Dave. And more importantly, thanks for kicking us off. That was a great conversation. So Travis, let's move to you and talk about the governance side of the non-governance committee. Obviously, lots of stuff going on. So let me flip it to you.
Yeah. So in NGC, to your point at the beginning, the question of, okay, well, what is it that NGC does as opposed to other committees, and how does that get allocated? One of the funny things that's come out of the last few years is the NGC has kind of said, well, because we get to decide in large part where a lot of the responsibilities lay among the different committees, we're going to allocate certain things to ourselves as opposed to others. So for example, I think a recent study showed that a majority of US public companies have either a separate ESG committee or have ESG allocated to the nomination and governance committee. I'll just say for the purpose of this discussion, it's going to be helpful for us to kind of break it up into different committees, human capital and comp committee, things like that. And it also helps for everybody's egos on the call as well. And so I don't have to cover all of it. But an important part of what the NGC is doing is trying to allocate oversight of these different topics to different committees. And as David mentioned, make sure that there's the right skill set in those particular committees in order to exercise that oversight. A funny thing about it with all of these new directors, as Dave was mentioning, is some of them have never been a public company director. Some of them have never been in the C-suite at all and don't really have the training that they need. I'll commend to the people that are on the call to think about some of the things that Janice and Stephen and Dave are going to be talking about and say, well, maybe my board needs training on those types of things. And I can recommend to NACD to suggest topics for future programming. Risk oversight, though, is one where allocating the different types of risk oversight often falls directly to audit. And we're finding more and more that a lot of NomGov committees over the last year or two are realizing that there's just not enough time on audit for them to look at every single mission critical risk out there. And they're reallocating certain things to certain committees, or they're actually establishing separate risk committees. Often that's in the context of an ESG committee. The allocation is usually done year over year as part of the annual board review, but it's something for a NomGov committee to make sure is specifically allocated so that if there is an incident that, you know, inevitably happens to someone every year, that there's that record of oversight that's being expressed. And that separately and apart from that, the NomGov committee is going to have the policies, procedures, and committee charters that allocate those responsibilities in a crystal clear way. Obviously, if you're a public company, most of your institutional investors are requiring that anyways, and the SEC as well. So right now, if you go and do a survey of public company charters of a NomGov committee, like I said, a majority of them are going to allocate that ESG responsibility to the NomGov committee if it's not in a separate ESG committee. There are some questions, though, of whether or not the NGC itself should be the one to cover those. So a great example is sustainability reporting. Just because somebody's on the NGC committee and has responsibility over ESG doesn't mean that they really understand scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3 GHG emissions, or that they understand disclosure controls. A lot of the time, those things are better allocated to the audit committee. Those are things that we can talk about later. For training, technology is one of the biggest items that we've seen over the last year. Coming out of the pandemic, there was the pandemic response. Now there's been a sort of normalization on that and a bigger focus on what are we going to have this year, whether that's recession response or the like. The technology adaptation, whether that's adopting cybersecurity, data privacy controls, AI and the like, or it's something more simple like just basic disclosure controls over accounting, are things that we're seeing more missing from some of the NGC discussions. I know Dave mentioned investor activism, and so I'll talk briefly about shareholder engagement. Obviously, the NomGov committee is usually the one that is responsible for ensuring that the corporation's organizational documents and other items reflect the best practices, or at least the standards set by the board with respect to a combined CEO chair, a lead independent director, and whether there are takeover defenses like a classified board, supermajority voting standards. ISS and Glass Lewis continue to tighten the screws with vote against recommendations. Usually those are targeted at the NomGov chair, or if you have a classified board, whoever the member of that committee is that's going to be up that year. But even outside of those litmus test items, it's the NGC that's having to deal with the ESG scores, most often that are coming from ISS, and finding ways to tweak the governance in order to meet the expectations of ISS and institutional investors, or sometimes explain to those investors in ISS why they're not going to make sense this year. A couple of recent developments just to talk about are in the bylaws. There's a big case in front of Massimo right now at the Delaware Chancery Court, talking about advance notice bylaws to try and stem the tide of activism. We're seeing that some of the companies that are being a little too aggressive are being held to task by the activist investors, and institutional investors are seeing some of these changes as being disenfranchising to the shareholder voting base. To Dave's earlier point about upgrading your directors, one of the best defenses to activism is actually looking and seeing who are your directors that are most likely to get replaced. Maybe you go ahead and either accelerate your succession planning or go through the process of actually removing and replacing or shrinking the board in order to limit some of those vulnerabilities. I'll be honest, I hear that a lot. I don't see too many companies doing that just because of what it does to the existing board dynamics. And if somebody has a question, we can cover it, but we don't need to get into too much on what you do once you have a block holder or conflicted director or insurgent director on that board. Special committees, confidentiality concerns, and the like are something the Delaware courts explored a lot last year. And we've seen a lot of people, particularly the NomGov committees that set up those, let's say, protective structures on the board of directors, get popped with lawsuits for it. So I'll pause there.
Great. Thank you, Travis. I had a question for you that was going to talk about how do you manage all the new regulations that are coming out, but you did a really nice job kind of answering that. And I suspect in the open Q&A, we'll come back to that. So my new question for you is, you know, from time to time, a particular committee seems to be in the hot seat all the time. You know, it used to be audit, maybe it still is audit, and then it went to compensation for a while. It feels like it's moving to the non-governance committee with all of the external pressures, the uncertainty, the succession, the litigation. What's the profile for non-gov committee members and then maybe even more importantly, the chair? And what do companies look for in that?
Well, I can definitely say Dave might have some thoughts on the recruitment side. I will say for my part, the NomGov committee should be independent. They should be diverse. One of the important things that we've seen over the years is the more diverse candidates that you have, or I guess members on the NGC, the more likely it is that you wind up with more diverse directors more broadly and more diverse executives. But the more critical function is that independence. If you have a NomGov committee that is not truly independent of the management team, they're going to do a lot more deference to the management team in terms of how governance is actually implemented, whether that's the examples that we saw with McDonald's and workplace harassment discussions, examples that we've seen, even simple things going back to Bluebell and Boeing, where an NGC member might say, I trust the management team to handle this for me. That's not how oversight works. That's not how the director's responsibilities work. it really is an obligation to ask the right questions, to make sure that your other directors are skilled enough and understand enough to be able to ask the right questions, and to make sure that they can pressure test management when they do push back.
Great, thanks, Travis. So Jan, I was going to tee you up and say you're going to tell us everything we need to know and how compensation committees are changed, but maybe even the title itself is changing. So let's give you the mantle.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and increasingly calling the compensation committee is a bit of a misnomer. We have seen the expansion of the compensation committee remit get both broader in terms of the types of things that they're paying attention to, but also deeper, paying attention to more than just the senior leadership in the organization, but really looking at the entire human capital spectrum. I will pile on some data to add to what Dave started us out with. If you look at the S&P 500, we are now at 49% of the S&P 500 have changed their comp committee name to be something that signifies a broader perspective or a broader remit. And if you go and actually open up the charters to see what does the compensation committee say they have responsibility for, that expansion is even wider. 84% of the S&P 500, if you read their charters, have at least one sort of non-traditional item that they have put into their responsibility of the comp committee, even if they haven't gone so far as to change the committee's name. And those areas of additional responsibility tend to be succession planning. And by succession planning, I mean succession planning that goes deeper than the traditional CEO only or CEO and CEO direct reports, but it's C-suite +1, C-suite +2 that companies and committees are paying attention to. And along with that, the related talent development and pipeline for those committees, for that succession. The other area that a lot of committees are delving into and paying attention to is DE&I and the whole issue around employee engagement, corporate culture, and it's not so much trying to take over and do a land grab to take over become a shadow management team, as much as it is just both querying management around the policies and procedures that are being put in place to deal with a really rapidly changing workforce landscape, but also being available to the management team as a sounding board and a group of diverse perspectives to help the management team with the problem solving of these issues that we've never come across before. Now, the kind of conundrum in there is that while everybody says, human capital, our people are our biggest assets, and comp committees are taking on all of these deeper, broader responsibilities with regard to human management, what you find is if you look at that skills matrix that Dave was talking about for board members, and we go back to our S&P 500 again, less than half of the S&P 500 includes in their skills matrix a separate category for human resources expertise, human capital management expertise. There seems to be this notion that somehow a CEO, by virtue of the fact that he or she has been a CEO, is a compensation expert or a human capital expert. And I am here to tell you they are not. So
If we were all CEOs, would you tell us the same thing, Jan?
I would. Yes, I would. I would tell you you are good at very many things, but you are not an expert at compensation. So as boards look to think about, and this gets to some of the overlap that you were talking about, Dennis, between the committees, as boards start to think about the valuable real estate sitting around the boardroom table, and you want to allocate a seat for the cyber expert, and you want to allocate a seat for the financial expert, and you want to allocate a seat for a digital economy expert. I'm going to make a plug for allocating a seat for a human capital expert.
Well, that seems like a pretty good allocation. Your stats were pretty interesting. The one thing you didn't, at least I didn't hear you say, maybe I was writing a couple notes, but you didn't say anything about pay versus performance, which seems to be the new hot topic. And I don't know what box I ought to put that one in, but talk to me a little bit about that one.
Sure. That is only one of a whole variety of new regulatory things that management and comp committees have to deal with. So I will rattle through these in no particular order. These all fall into the category of boring but important. So the SEC, we've long awaited under Dodd-Frank. There were a couple of things that had yet to be implemented from Dodd-Frank, which was adopted, more than a decade ago. One of the outstanding things was the pay versus performance disclosure. The SEC finally came out with the final rules on that this past summer and said, oh, by the way, companies, you have to comply with this in your 2023 proxy season, which put everybody into a tizzy. It is a ton of work. For those of you who are public companies, we're far enough along in the season that you've actually probably already seen presentations and maybe even drafts of the disclosure. So I won't go into detail on that. I would just say, in terms of things to think about from a committee perspective or board perspective, there is a hope by a lot of people that this PVP disclosure will go the way of the CEO pay ratio disclosure and will simply become one more compliance thing that gets dumped into the very end of the proxy statement. I think the extent to whether or not that happens largely depends on what ISS, Glass Lewis, and institutional investors end up doing with that data. They have said, ISS and Glass Lewis have both said that for 2023, they are not going to use this new disclosure to affect their methodology or their say on pay recommendations at all. But that may not hold true in future years. If they somehow decide that these numbers matter, then these numbers will matter. The other thing that is noteworthy is while management has been spending a lot of time on the primary table that does the compensation actually paid calculation, we've heard comments from some institutional investors that they are actually far more interested in the secondary table, which is the listing of the metrics that companies deem to be important to determining executive compensation. And that institutional investors have suggested they are far more interested in the signaling that a company puts forth by what 7 items do they put on that list than they are in the actual cap numbers in the primary table. So take that as food for thought. The other kind of regulatory stuff that's swirling around out there, to just touch on briefly, clawbacks. That was also kind of a remaining item in Dodd-Frank. The clawbacks are We are waiting for the SEC adopted rules. We are waiting for the listing standards to come out of both the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. Those listing rules are expected to be finalized and disclosed and are released next week, at which point then companies will have to comply. So compliance will be sort of towards the end of 2023 in terms of a date. The thing to know about the clawback rules is it is only for financial restatements. It applies to both big R restatements and little R restatements, and it is mandatory. Most companies' current clawback rules give the company the right, but not the obligation to claw back compensation if it's deemed to have been inappropriately paid. This new rule, the SEC's new rule, you no longer can have the discretion to choose not to go after the money. You have to go after the money. So what the current thinking that I'm hearing is that most companies are going to adopt a layered approach to clawbacks, and they will keep the current clawback policy that they have that applies to usually a larger group of folks, and also tends to include non-financial reasons for clawback like bad behaviors. And they will layer on a new clawback rule that is SEC compliant, but is very limited to only Section 16 officers. Third item on the regulatory front, 10b5-1 plans. 10b5-1 plans actually go into place immediately. They're effective next week. And the new 10b5-1 plans, which is the kind of programmed trading rules, are much, much, much stricter than the old rules. Most notably, there is a 90-day cooling off period. So if you were to go to your broker and say, I'd like to implement a 10b5-1 plan, the first day that anything could be traded under that plan is 90 days from now. You also cannot have overlapping 10b5-1 plans. So once you put a plan in place, that's the only 10b5-1 plan you can have until you cancel that one and put in a new one and wait a new 90 days. So it is much more restrictive than the old plans. The other thing about the 10b5-1 plans is there is a new heightened level of disclosure. For anybody who's sitting on the audit committee, and this will be a lead into Stephen, there will be a new disclosure in the Qs that has to list all of the 10b5-1 plans that were entered into over the past quarter or that were canceled over the past quarter. So a much higher level of disclosure, a much more strict definition of what qualifies as a 10b5-1 plan. Next item I want to touch on, I only got two more. So the next item is the FTC, not to be left out. This has put in place a vote in early January on a national ban on non-competes. This rule is very, very broad. It would be a sea change in the way we manage employment contracts and executive retention issues, because it would eliminate the use of non-competes. You wouldn't be able to put in garden leave programs. You wouldn't be able to have very broad non-solicitation agreements. You wouldn't be able to put in standstills for, say, for example, Pearl Meyer. An engagement letter with us says, for the pendency of our relationship, we promise not to steal your people if you promise not to steal our people. That would have to be, we couldn't do that under these proposed rules. So we expect that this will be face many, many, many lawsuits, beginning with, does the FTC even have the right to do this? Or are they playing way outside of the boundaries? And even once you get to there, even if they decide the FTC does have the right to do this, this proposed rule is so broad that it will not go into effect as written, but we could get some version of this that would still have significant implications. The last thing I will mention is, as of January 1st, there was a survey that was done by Paychex that stated that as of January 1st, 1 in 4 employees in the US now lives in a jurisdiction where pay transparency laws are in place. This doesn't necessarily change compensation programs, but it does change the way companies need to think about how they talk about their compensation programs with their employees. You know, we always do things, you know, behind closed doors that we might not do if it was in the light of day. Assume now that all of your compensation decisions are made in the light of day.
Fun stuff, huh, Jan?
Oh yeah.
Must be the Full Employment Act for.
It is absolutely our Full Employment Act.
Hey, I know we're going to come back to some of these questions in the open chat, but for the sake of time, I'm going to move to Stephen and talk about what's going on in the audit committee space. Though I think everybody's kind of teed you up a little bit, Mr. Dabney. So take it away.
Thank you, Dennis. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to touch on 2 things, both of which have real impact to the audit committee. The one is the climate rule, the second being cyber. I certainly am not going to go into great detail with respect to climate. I suspect most, if not everyone on this call, has gotten a fair dose of board education relative to the proposed climate rule. But I did want to touch on a couple of things. So just to level set, the commission proposed the rule in April of 22. The commission received approximately 13,000 response letters, 4,000 of which were unique. Unique being thoughtful, diligent, something that required reading, processing, and if you, as we did at the firm, look at those responses, well, we didn't look at all of them. We looked at enough to really discern that the rule got quite a bit of support across really all number of stakeholders. Technology, if you look at industry, technology and professional services were 2 of the biggest supporters of the climate rule. The staff has come out here in January and said, expect to see the climate rule in April. For many of you, you know that that's never firm. It could slip to the right. But I think most of us would conclude that the release of a final rule relative to climate is imminent. And if I would define imminent here in the next 60 to 90 days, I don't foresee it going further than that. That's obviously speculative, but I think there are so many stakeholders who are pushing for this. I think there would be an upheaval if the commission didn't release it in that time frame. A couple of other observations. There is no secret that there are issuers and there are trade groups sitting and waiting for this rule to be released to file litigation. It will be almost immediate. And while I want to be careful because I'm not a lawyer, you know, the question really is when those suits are filed, will there be a stay and everyone just stands still while it works its way through the system, or in the absence, everyone continues down the path of compliance with the rule in its form. So two other observations with respect to the rule. speculative, but when we look at it, there are probably two areas that are likely to be changed relative to the proposal. The first of which, and maybe the easiest of which, is the bright line 1% materiality threshold. That got a lot of negative feedback, and the staff clearly heard and I think is processing that. The alternative to the 1% would be the exercise of judgment that preparers and auditors use on a daily basis when preparing financial statements and auditing them. And that is, it's just a exercise of judgment as to what is financially material. So again, being speculative, I would not be surprised to see some relief in regards to that bright line test. Obviously, scope 3 is the second area. I think issuers believe, look, I can go capture, measure, and put controls around my scope 1 and my scope 2. But whatever I do around scope 3 is, for the most part, an estimate for which it is really hard to put rigorous controls around. So I would not be surprised to see some form of relief relative to scope 3. Any number of options are available to the commission relative to relief around scope 3. They could ask, well, you know, provide it, but it wouldn't be subject to attestation. Don't provide it at all, or delay over a period of time that which would be required to be disclosed and audited, i.e. maybe you say scope 3, you got 2 or 3 years to get ready before that becomes filed and audited. So the rule is imminent, likely to see, most certainly we'll see some changes. And if we were to guess, those would be the two areas that would be most meaningful.
Stephen, before you move on, one of the things that you didn't mention, that maybe it's not as important as the bright line 1% or the scope 3 stuff, but as I understand the current proposal and the attestation element suggests that whoever's providing whatever attestation has to be a firm subject to PCAOB inspections. If that were to survive, that's kind of a game changer for the current service providers, that lots of companies who think they're doing the right thing by getting a third party may have to find a different third party, or it's going to be acquisition central at the big four and the next tier worth of firms. Could you speak to that one?
Yeah, Dennis, yeah, that is what the proposal calls for. As many know, that in past years, there were those in the S&P 500 that would get some type of certification on metrics included in their CSR, but they were doing so with the help of engineering firms and others. And you're exactly right. If it gets mandated into an external auditing firm registered with the PCAOB, there is going to be a ramp up in resources. Certainly, the big four firms are anticipating that with or without the mandate, because there's already been an uptick. And the profile, Dennis, of the people that we're hiring looked a little different than, you know, guys like you and I, right? Because you need folks who know how to audit greenhouse gases and things of that nature. And that's not things that we've been per se trained on. So to answer your question, yeah, it is going to require a ramp up. Let me just speak to one other climate related element, and that's the following. Regardless of where the commission goes with the final rule, the stakeholders demanding ESG data is not going to stop. And corporate America is responding to it already. And that momentum, again, in my opinion, will not stop. The interesting thing is the staff, under the current rules, has really ramped up the number of comment letters prepared and sent to issuers. And in fact, they sent in this past review cycle 70 comment letters specific to climate. And that 70 letters accounted for 480 comments. The most prominent, not surprising, the most prominent comment was the staff inquiring about consistency between the filed Form 10K and your CSR, and identification of what they viewed as inconsistencies between what was said or disclosed in one document or the other. Clearly, in this case, the issuers had a defense, and the defense was there are very prescriptive rules for the 10K. We complied with those. And then we have a CSR report that we prepare for the benefit of a much broader stakeholder group. And we may provide additional information in the CSR that doesn't go into the 10K. The staff was, for the most part, willing to accept that argument and really didn't push back. The staff made a number of inquiries regarding carbon credits and offsets. If the issuer came back, quantified in the response those credits and offsets, the staff generally accepted that and moved on. The staff asked in 95% of the letters about physical climate risk. So point is this isn't going away. Whatever happens with the rule itself, may slow certain elements of it, attestation, scope 3, but the momentum will not relent, and the staff will continue to press by way of comment letters using the rules out there right now that they expect compliance with. And the last thing I'll tell you is the PCOB is not far behind them. The PCOB this past cycle did what they called targeted reviews. Those reviews were specific to climate. The PCOB staff was very clear that it was educational in nature. I would say the PCOB staff took a relatively soft touch when they executed the targeted inspections. I don't think any comments came from them, but they too are getting focused. They're acknowledging they're trying to get smarter. And the most prominent question is, if you take something like oil field services, the question is, well, if people are moving to green energy, does that have some implication for your traditional tangible assets that you're using in the day-to-day execution of your business? That is was proved to be a relatively easy comment to respond to, because the energy space is in an up cycle, and number two, it's going to take a long time to transition to green. I only offer that example to you because it is where the staff is going and the PCOB is going with respect to auditors.
Hey, Stephen,
Yes.
the participants are firing up the chat room.
Yeah.
I know I want to get to that, but I know you had cyber. Can you give me a 2-minute version of cyber?
Yeah,
There's
maybe
also
even,
some cyber questions come in, so we'll
Yeah,
spend more time on it.
yeah, maybe even more quickly. When I think about cyber, I think about being that director who is going to be named as the subject matter expert. And that's a heavy weight to carry, likely as one person on the board. Because as Janice pointed out, the boards are getting to the point where you've got somebody who's the financial statement expert, somebody who is cyber, somebody who's a strategy, and you find yourself kind of being that person who's responsible for really exercising oversight. What's my point? It's a lot of risk. It's a lot of responsibility for one person. And if I those people are in high demand from a recruitment perspective, but lots and lots of risk going forward. The second observation is, if you have an incident, you have 4 days to disclose. And for any of you that have been through a meaningful cyber incident, after 4 days, you sometimes don't know how many systems have they penetrated, how long have they been there, how much data have they gathered, are they still there? 4 days in the context of a material cyber investigation is nothing. And the risk, right, that you can foresee is in the boardroom. There will be a desire to comply with the rule, but general counsel, for good reason, will be incredibly nervous because he or she will know whatever is disclosed in that Form 10K will not be the complete story. And you subject yourself to litigation because somebody says, well, what you put into the Form 8K was not complete. So that's going to be tricky. And then the other thing that I think most people are going to rely on here is an assertion that said cyber incident wasn't material. Well, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that exercise of judgment. But the question is whether or not the board, the CISO, and others have developed a methodology, no different than, frankly, an estimate included in your consolidated financial statements, whereby you quantify that risk in order to conclude, is it material or otherwise? And you don't want to be doing that on the fly. You want to be having that conversation before it happens so that you can have a thorough and timely conversation about, well, which bucket does it fall in? And if it falls into material, then you've got a whole nother issue that we've already talked about. But important to develop that methodology, again, so you're not developing it under pressure.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Yep, thank you, Stephen. We're going to pivot in a second to the open Q&A, and I've got some great questions in front of me that I'll toss around to our experts. But first, Maya, if you could put on the screen the word cloud, and as the participants, or at least those who submitted this survey response, understand, these are some of the key items that were on your minds. Trying to see how many people. Guess we had 12 people submit, so 12 of the 90-something people that are on the call. The largest one is the economy. We consciously didn't go into the economic thing. To me, that's a big topic for all boards, and different committees are impacted differently. But everything else, you just see a litany of items that people are thinking about and talking about. And as you look at some of these, by their nature, they hit several committees of boards, and several are full board topics. So with that, let's move back to the screen with the experts, and I'm gonna kick off. I'm gonna push a couple questions around, so forgive me for looking at my phone for the questions. But Dave, I'm going to put the first one to you. And we were just talking about cyber. And so one of the questions is, what are companies doing with that temptation or that desire to get a cyber expert on the board so you can deal with some of these new regulations and what clearly is a genuine concern for companies operating today and for boards who oversee those operations?
Yeah, Dennis, so it is one of the hot topics, has been now for a little while, because obviously these cyber attacks make headlines. Headlines are things that get the board's attention. And for that reason, many are looking to go ahead and add a cyber expert to the board. Even some companies who we normally would say, talk to us a little bit about the risk you see and the knowledge you seek, because cyber comes in so many flavors. Is to depend on your business model and whether you're a B2B or a B2C type business type. And so many are also wondering, and what's happening in general with boards, and we view, because add cyber, climate, ESG, and all this, we think you're going to see boards have generally shrunk. In actuality, they're going to grow over the coming years to add some of these experts to them, because there's no other way to solve it for now. And as Stephen said, there are people we talk to who literally have, that is in their title, cybersecurity. So like they're fully comfortable with it. But when you are the person standing tall in the corporation on the board to do that, that's a heavy lift to go ahead and do. And even they're trying, and we're trying to educate them on what that can mean, because that still evolves. But the point I was going to make is boards will be expanding due to these special issues. And boards are really loath to add a one topic board member because board seats are so cherished, but they really aren't going to have much choice in the interim. And we're going to see some of that. What they love is, and I'll make it up, but it's a little bit of a dramatization, but I need the cyber expert. I need it on B2B, B2C, and also on other digital issues. And I need them to be a woman and ethnically diverse. And we're like, okay, so we're trying to solve a lot of things with this one issue. So what we try to do is distill down what's a gotta have and what's a nice to have here, but it is a very hot topic.
Great, thanks for that. Hey, Jan, I know we had you teed up as the compensation committee expert, but you've helped us redefine it or rename it to human capital. Mm-hmm. One of the things we haven't talked about that we talk a lot about, or have lots of other people are talking about, is, are we returning to the office or not? If we are, what's it look like? And is this quiet quitting continuing, or is that starting to subside?
Well, I think like most pendulums, they swing all the way out to one end and then they swing back towards the middle. I think we're starting to see it swing back towards the middle. We go from quiet quitting to quiet firing. But I still think, where most of this is coming down is that companies that are too hardline and have tried to implement, back to the office 5 days a week, are getting tremendous pushback from employees who don't want to do that. They like the flexibility of being able to come to the office sometimes, but not all the time. I think companies haven't quite settled into this yet. There are a lot of sort of knock-on issues that come along with that work from home. There's because on the one hand, as you're working from home, one of the biggest concerns is, how do we manage, forget all the costs associated with that, and the fact that we're all paying a lot of money for buildings that are sitting largely empty. But there's also the issue around, how do you create a culture and an engaged workforce when nobody spends time physically together, which would suggest that if you think back to an era where companies said, we've got to get rid of all of our middle layers of middle management, we're going to flatten the organization, you now have, so you have people with very large scopes of responsibility in terms of direct reports. It's really hard to manage a big group of direct reports when you physically spend no time together, when everything has to be done by Zoom. So there's one argument that says, does this mean we need to rethink how the organization is structured and span of control around our managers? On the flip side, I was just reading earlier this week that a lot of what the tech companies are talking about and all the layoffs that they've been doing is getting rid of what they call the PML, the professional management layer, that we want to go kind of, again, flatten that organization so that there are senior people and then there are the doers, and you don't have managers managing managers, managing managers, managing managers. I think there's a lot of stuff in there, you know. Then you layer on pay transparency, then you layer on when you can work from anywhere, do companies get rid of their geographic pay differentials, which almost everybody has. So there's a whole host of things that I think yet have to be worked out.
Great, thank you, Jan.
I know we said we weren't going to go too much into the economy. There is a solution for all of this. The jobs reports are so strong right now. If it changes in the other direction, the leverage is going to shift dramatically to the employers, and they'll say either come in or you're fired.
Fair point.
We're not there yet.
Hey, Travis, there's a question that talks about, with all the regulations going on, are there are corporations doing major rewrites of bylaws and charters to document where all these new regs are being addressed committee by committee?
No. So there are some things that are proposed where they're having to address these, but typically no. A lot of this goes into the proxy statement so that they can disclose to investors who wants to see, the investors want to see who has responsibility for what. And the cybersecurity disclosure proposal that Stephen mentioned back from May, you know, the SEC is going to require disclosure about who has responsibility for cybersecurity, what the board's expertise is, things like that. But no, a lot of this is more when you are trying to present your board in that proxy statement and in your, you know, interactions with stockholders. That's where you really need to communicate this to the investors to make sure that you're effectively ensuring that the investors understand why they should be reelected.
Hey, Stephen, there's a couple questions coming in from an audit committee perspective, and you know, audit committee, I guess that's the normal title for that committee, but it's also called the kitchen drawer. I always use the old Life cereal commercial. I know you're a lot younger than me, Stephen. So is Travis, and probably you too, Dave. But you know, the old Life commercial was, give it a Mikey, he'll eat anything.
He'll eat anything.
Other than climate and cyber, how are audit committees, what are they dealing with, knowing they have a very full agenda and not a lot of time?
Yeah, Dennis, when I think about the audit committee, and it won't surprise anyone, being that I'm an auditor, you know, I do acknowledge, because in NACD programming, our own programming, we talk about the evolving remit of the audit committee. We've talked about the fact that NomGov kind of says, okay, you're the financial expert. What I'm kind of encouraging, and I would encourage everyone to think about, is, listen, that remit is getting larger, but don't fail to focus on your knitting, and that is financial reporting and, you know, the quality of that reporting. Again, it is fundamental to the oversight of the audit committee, but it does run some risk of being overlooked, given all of the other pressing issues especially with the emergence of the climate rule and cyber. And just let me say one thing, Dennis, about that. When I think about financial reporting, managing the relationship with external audit, internal audit, what I'm thinking about, Dennis, is NomGov probably needs to sit back and say, do we really have the right skill sets on audit, so that it's not just one person sitting on that committee who is really, to Dave's point, standing tall when it comes time to looking at the financial statements that are getting filed and managing those other relationships, because all too often I see that it does fall to one individual, and the other committee members in many cases hope he or she is doing that formidable job.
Yeah, when you're that one person standing tall, it's really good when it's blue skies and sun. It gets a little knee buckling when the storm cloud comes in. So good advice. And let me first say thank you, Dave, Travis, Jan, Stephen. Great way to kick off our committee programming for 2023. So thank you for that.